I know some folks are done with the film at this point, and I'm sure some people are still finishing up because I know a few folks had audio issues at the beginning. So I think we're going to wait just a couple minutes. Okay. I'm getting messages from folks that they're all done and ready to go. So we'll move on. So we'll get started answering some questions here. It's my pleasure to introduce our special guest tonight. Ann Giblin is the interim director of the Ecosystem Center at Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole and is a director of the Plum Island Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Research Site. Ann holds a PhD in ecology from the Boston University Marine Program and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Her current research projects include an examination of the effects of climate change, land use, and sea level on the marsh ecosystem surrounding Plum Island, a study of lake ecosystem responses to environmental change in Alaska, and an investigation into the effects of the Macondo oil spill on salt marshes in the Gulf of Mexico. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ann.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So we have a couple of great questions here coming in. Let's see. Let's start with a kind of general one about barrier islands. Chris says, barrier islands undergo natural shifting of sand and sand dunes independently of sea level change. The film seems to conflate that process with the separate challenges that will be caused by sea level rise. Is there an issue with doing that, or does it help by drawing attention to the risks, even if the visible damage on barrier islands may be due to interrupted sand transport rather than sea level rise?
I think there was some conflation, but I don't think it's inappropriate. But whatever processes are removing the sand from the beach because you've interrupted the supply, eroding the beach in front of houses, is going to make them more vulnerable, and then rising sea levels are going to add to that risk. So I agree there. You can have big problems with barrier beaches that have nothing to do with sea level rise, but it does confound the risk a little bit.
Great. We have a question specific to Gloucester here, actually. They're asking, what is the projected relative rise of sea level for Gloucester if this person lives on Gloucester's eastern point? And maybe if you know, what are we looking at in this general area on the North Shore?
Right. Well, so it's sort of interesting. There's a little bit difference between Boston and Portland, and there's not many stations in between. We've actually set up a station now in Plum Island, which actually suggests sea level rise there is maybe just slightly higher than Boston rate of sea level rise. But, the long-term 100-year average is something like 2.4 millimeters a year. And we start looking at the last 20 years, 30 years or so, we're looking more about 4 millimeters a year. And I think that's probably very close to what you would see for Gloucester. The predictions are for accelerated sea level rise, and that would be maybe taking it to as much as 3 feet by 2100 for most of the North Shore.
And this kind of goes along with another question we have in the chat here. This person says, if a large storm breaches Cape Cod, Mass Bay will surge floods into Boston as well as smaller places like Marshfield and Gloucester. What can we do to visualize these impacts? That kind of goes along with, how do we visualize how much sea level rise we might see in this area generally?
I think the chance of, at least for quite some time, of a large storm really really breaching most of the outer part of Cape Cod is fairly low. I mean, if you've ever been out there, those are a very robust dune system until you get sort of into a few little areas on the neck. Um, storm surge is driven by the amount of fetch you have and the wind direction. But I don't necessarily consider that to be an immediate hazard. I think a bigger thing to worry about is the fact that you have, again, if you have a rise of 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, then you've got a much higher sea set that you're experiencing that storm surge on.
And I know, Anne, I think you've done some studies on marsh accretion, right?
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about that a little bit and how that relates to how high the water is as well?
Well, that's what's really so great about marshes. I mean, they have been keeping up with sea level rise for the last several thousand years. Sea level rise was slower, more like 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters a year until recently, last 100 years or so. But they keep up with that by two mechanisms. One is they just trap sediments. And the more robust the grass grows, the more sediments they trap, just like, the thicker the head of hair you have, the more sand gets caught on it when you're in the beach. But the other thing is that if you ever dug around in a salt marsh, the plants produce lots and lots of roots and below ground stems, and not all of that decomposes. So that actually helps the marsh keep up with sea level rise. So a lot of our research is trying to figure out what is the limit of that. They seem to be keeping up with sea level rise at a rate of about 2 to 3, maybe 4 millimeters a year now. Can they go to 6? Can they go to 8? We don't know. We do know, if you look back in the geologic record, when sea level was rising really fast, like a centimeter a year after the last glaciation, there were no marshes. So whether that represents their physiological limit or whether that was some other factor, we don't know.
And have scientists around here come to any conclusions about whether artificial marsh rising is going to be something that's helpful, like deliberately adding soil to the marsh?
So I think that's being actively investigated in a lot of places. One thing we do know, I mean, most of you are listening, I'm sure, are on the North Shore, and remember when we had that bomb cyclone a couple of years ago with all that ice in February. And that event led to a lot of the water being frozen at the bottom of the tide creeks. And then that really high tide picked up giant blocks of ice, as big as tractor trailers, and threw them up on the marsh, and frozen into the bottom of those chunks of ice was sediment. And that led to sediment being deposited around the marsh, and, in some areas as much as several inches deep. And that seems to have been overall has not had any long-term negative consequences, might have had some good consequences and helped the marsh keep up with sea level rise in those restricted little areas. So that was sort of a natural experiment that suggests the marsh can tolerate some amount of sediment additions.
Thank you. Yeah. This person, Chris, says, Plum Island LTER project, what are your observations on sea level rise impacting the local ecosystem? So kind of answered that. How does it impact, I mean, we talk about the marsh because it's sort of a barrier, a natural barrier that helps us, mitigate the effects of climate change on humans who live in the area. And have you done any studies on whether it's retreating or expanding, or how, what are we looking at? Do we have enough marsh to protect us?
Well, if we're looking at the Great Marsh, it's a very extensive marsh. I mean, studies have shown actually this was work done at University of Maine, as little as 20 feet of marsh can significantly reduce tidal energy. So they're great storm buffers. We've been using aerial photographs and on the ground transects and things like that, along with other groups such as the Fish and Wildlife Group, some of the studies at UNH. And we've been trying to map changes in the marsh over the near term and decades, and then looking back as far as we can with old aerial photographs. Right now, the marsh is fairly stable. What we think is going to happen, even if sea level rise accelerates over the next century or so, is the marsh will lose some area. We are seeing, erosion at some of the ends along the sound. but the biggest change is going to be the marsh is going to switch largely from what we see now, which is salt marsh hay, Spartina patens, to much more Spartina alterniflora as sea levels get higher and inundation gets more frequent.
And how about beaches? They talked a lot about beaches in the film. Are our beaches sort of a protective living barrier for us, or not so much because we've developed so close to them and there are jetties in places? In what way will that affect the people living in this area?
Well, I think you've seen places like Plum Island that there is substantial beach erosion in some places. I think that barrier beach dune system will survive, but it's not necessarily certain that there won't be significant erosion at the north end where there is most of the houses. There are places all around Massachusetts where houses are on beaches that are eroding away. And, you know, as you've seen, there's places where they're doing sand augmentation projects.
Mm-hmm. Oh, an interesting question on that same topic of erosion. Can oyster farming help with erosion?
So that's a new thing people are trying, is to put oyster reefs sort of in areas in front of salt marshes where those salt marshes are eroding, to try to do the same sort of thing they talked about in the film with those giant reef balls. But oyster reefs also absorb wave energy quite nicely. I think at the moment we don't know for sure. The only thing I guess I caution about is whether it's a beach ball or whether it's an oyster reef or whatever you put in front of either the beach or your house to protect it is going to be subject to fairly intense wave energy, and just have to make sure it doesn't end up ripping out and causing more harm than it was due to protect. But I think there could be some benefits from oyster reefs.
That's interesting. I know, at least in my town, there's been some debate about certain people having, walls to protect their property, which then affects their neighbors who don't have a wall right next to them. And that kind of ties in with this question from David. Sea level rise doesn't respect town borders. Can you address the need for regional approaches and resources to address the issue?
Yeah, I think that's really a critical one. And I would go beyond town. I mean, one thing the state of Rhode Island has done, which I think is really an excellent idea, is they did a statewide marine planning program. And that where they identified all sorts of critical resources, everything from nesting birds to fishing spots and everything else like that. And they tried to map out areas that were very critical. And also that helped them do things like plan out maybe potential, where they did plan a potential area for an offshore wind farm. But so by identifying all the critical areas in the entire state and all the resources that needed protection, I think you can do a much better job of managing, because it's too small a system to manage on a town by town basis.
Yeah, absolutely. That ties into another question from Bodie. What can be done individually and collectively, state and federal level, to curb the rise of sea level or to reduce its impact?
We can't curb sea level unless we start curbing CO2 emissions. And that was the one thing that they didn't emphasize in the film that I think would have been really nice to have emphasized, which is whenever you look at these projections of sea level rise and they go from 1 foot to 6 feet, that's not just scientists being inaccurate in their understanding of ocean physics or the atmosphere. It's because we don't know what the CO2 path is going to be going forward. So those projections range from basically stopping CO2 emissions by 2050 to assuming we don't do anything to curb CO2 emissions way up to 2100. So that's what gives that enormous range of sea level rise projections. It's not the physics, it's the uncertainty in humans. So the biggest thing we have to do is curb CO2 emissions to the greatest extent possible.
And I know they mentioned in the film about the ice caps melting, but is sea level rise due majority to that or more to the temperature of the ocean rising, and especially in the Gulf of Maine? What particularly is affecting us here?
globally, up until about 20 years ago, it was thought that it was equally thermal expansion and melting from ice on land. Now, melting from ice on land has exceeded the amount of thermal expansion. I think thermal expansion accounts for less than half of the sea level rise, but that's global. Locally, the other factor that we have here, one of the other factors we have is the Gulf Stream. So the Gulf Stream is sort of that giant ocean river that runs up south of Cape Cod and then heads off to England. And that actually sort of pulls water away from our coast. And that's been weakening with climate change. So as that weakens, that accelerates our local, or I should say our regional rate of sea level rise.
Wow. Actually, this question came in from two different people. This film is from 2016, so it's a little old, and misses many of the changes that have happened in the last 4 years, nationally and locally. Do these changes that we've seen in the last 4 years change anything for Essex County specifically?
I think we sort of had a strange night to be talking about this, huh? We sort of had a pause in really seriously addressing CO2 emissions for the last 4 years. I'm hoping that will change, because I really think sea level rise is one really large factor that's going to impact us, but so is warming. And we really do need to start working on controlling CO2 emissions. So I just hope that we go forward as a country and as a world and try to actually lick this problem.
A question from Vincent. What kind of ocean flora can mitigate storm surge?
Well, as mentioned in the film, coral reefs, seagrass beds, salt marshes, all of those vegetated or hard structures slow down wave energy. So any of those sort of things are very helpful.
I know NOAA has some, NOAA has some really neat visualization tools. Is there any place that you suggest for people to go to get more information and get some really sort of hands-on visualization of what's going to happen in our region specifically?
Actually, I wish I remembered the website, but the NOAA sea level rise slider bar thing, if somebody knows what it is, they can put it in the chat, is really informative, because you can pick different rates of sea level rise and you just slide the bar over and you can look to see where you live and you can see what the impact of that is going to be on sea level rise. It's what they call a bathtub model. So it doesn't assume that the marshes are going to keep up sea level rise necessarily any more than they are now. And it somewhat underestimates potential flooding from the land side. So for example, in Boston, as sea level rises, you also get flooding from the backside, because the rivers essentially back up. It might slightly underestimate that depending upon what it assumes for changes in precipitation, but it's a nice way to visualize it.
Let's see here. What, from Christina, actually, I think she has two questions, so let me get to them one at a time. What are your thoughts on harnessing wave energy and the impacts that it might have to our shorelines and sea level rise?
That's a good one, and I wish I knew the answer. I think tidal energy and wave energy is something that people are really just starting to look at. They're doing much more work with that in Canada. I think super large scale projects can have impacts. I mean, there was once a proposal to sort of harness the whole Bay of Fundy with a giant tidal power project, and I think the estimates were that it would have flooded Boston. But I think for smaller scale tidal energy stuff, there's a group up working with some people at Maine, up in Maine, a place called Goat Island, where the bunch of students and professors and high school teachers have gotten together and trying to see if they can power an offshore lighthouse with tidal energy and solar power and not replace an aging cable. So I think there's some promise there, but we haven't fully explored it.
I haven't ever heard of that. That's really neat to explore. Nick has a question. Does storm surge and erosion mitigation in one area just make matters worse for people somewhere else if the real issue is sea level rise?
I'm sorry, I missed that somehow.
Sorry. Does storm surge or erosion mitigation in one area just make matters worse for people somewhere else if the real issue is sea level rise?
I think I think as pointed out maybe earlier, sometimes those are a little bit disconnected from one another. Often beach augmentation is not a permanent solution, and that sand then moves downstream. That might be good for the people living downstream, or as pointed out in the film, it can be bad if it all ends up in an offshore reef.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's another question from Christina. She says, it seems like greed and short-term vision is winning out in beach restoration. What's the answer? Education for the government officials that are allowing this?
So I'm probably a little bit more charitable than that. I think education is certainly the answer, but I think there are cases where they're doing things like beach nourishment, not just for greed, but because of things like habitat for nesting shorebirds or for turtles, as well as tourists and the like. I think that one thing I did like about the film is they pointed out there's a lot of uncertainty in what's the best solution, and there's a lot of competing demands. But I think really spending some time and again, maybe doing a regional look at some of these problems and trying to come up with a regional solution is sort of the way to go.
What are some of your favorite solutions that you think are maybe most promising?
Well, I'm not a geomorphologist, so I try to stay in my lane a little bit. But I am interested in some of these living shoreline type solutions. Oyster reefs are one of them. There's other places where they're putting basically artificial salt marshes in front of salt marshes to try to slow down erosion rates and stabilize marshes. So I think that has a lot of promise. And I think in general, to protect our shorelines, wetland restoration, marsh restoration, dune restoration, restoring the natural systems, and then avoiding compounding the mistakes of the past by not building new stuff in all these sensitive areas. I think we're going to have to move back from some of them, but we don't have to compound the problem by building in these areas right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In your experience with different universities and the other researchers who are working right now, are there any new studies going on that you're excited about?
Well, I think we're pretty excited with some of the studies we're doing at Plum Island, sort of looking at some of these different ways that marsh grasses do react to sea level rise and what the impact of that is going to be. And I think the other thing we're sort of excited about is seeing how some of these changes are affecting the ecosystem and whether they're going to be good or bad. I mean, it's maybe they're exciting studies. It doesn't mean that I necessarily think all the changes will be good, but we're seeing big changes in water temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, and that's bringing southern species up into areas like Plum Island. So it's sort of an amazing natural experiment to see what happens when sort of north meets south and how these different organisms are going to interact with one another and what the end result is going to be on the food web.
Yeah, that's very cool. We're seeing that too on land with our work with some invasive species, but also just southern species migrating up this way as it gets warmer. It's interesting. So if folks want to get involved and do something to help out with this in their own communities or statewide or nationally, do you have any suggestions for where they should start?
Well, there's a lot of programs, both at the Fish and Wildlife Refuge and at the with Mass Audubon, and I suspect with Greenbelt, a lot of opportunities for restoration type of work, either removing invasive species. I know Mass Audubon was very heavily involved with a project to remove invasive pepperweed from some of the wetland areas. I'm sure that you all have conservation projects. I've been working with a group called the Gulf of Maine Institute, which works mainly with high school groups and having students work on pollinator strips. It's not effective sea level rise, but just doing different things to increase the value of the natural habitat, I think is something that everybody could get out to do, and it's kind of fun.
That's great. Yeah, Christina mentioned Salem Sound Coast Watch and their pepperweed poll. Yep, Greenbelt has some conservation projects along the coast and also in our other reservations that people can get involved with. So yeah, that's great. Well, it looks like our questions are kind of slowing down here. So I guess any sort of final thoughts on the film and your own work, Pam?
Well, I think it does point out that these questions are complex and there's not always easy answers, and that sometimes extreme polarization of the views is not where we want to go. We want to sort of get everybody together and try to think about what some of these best solutions might be for our communities. And the other thing is, I think there are some things we're going to have to actually just try and experiment on and be willing to say that they didn't work and try something else.
That's how science works.
Right.
Great. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up then. Thank you so much, Anne, for being here. Your expertise was really phenomenal to have. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As you know, we've had a long association with Greenbelt, and it's been a pleasure.
It is absolutely our pleasure. So thank you. And thanks everybody who watched the film with us and joined in the discussion. Have a great night.
Good night.
Take care.